The auction gavel came down like a verdict, and Nell Harrowgate did not flinch. She stood at the back of the marquee that had been erected on the very land her grandmother once walked, watching men in wax jackets and green Wellingtons bid on the bones of Thornfield Farm, as though it were an estate sale of a stranger's life. 460 acres of Yorkshire pasture, a milking parlor that hadn't turned a profit in 11 years, a farmhouse with a subsiding east wall, and a debt that had grown teeth. The land agent, a smooth young man named Rupert Callies from the firm of Vane and Callies, had assured the assembled buyers that everything was unencumbered, motivated, and available for immediate completion. He had not looked at Nell once. Nobody had, really. That was the thing about grief dressed in a supermarket coat and sensible boots. It made a woman invisible. Lot 14, Callies called, the residential dwelling and adjoining outbuildings. We'll start the bidding at 180,000. Nell felt the number land in her chest. 6 weeks ago she had buried her father, Edmund Harrowgate, in the churchyard at Nethercombe, and 3 days after that a solicitor she had never met had informed her, with the practiced gentleness of a man delivering bad news for a living, that the farm was mortgaged to the rafters, cross-secured against a business loan she had never heard of, and that the lender, a regional agricultural finance house called Penn Land and Credit, was calling everything in. Her father had signed the papers 18 months before he died. He had never mentioned a word of it to her. 180, do I hear 200? A man near the front raised a laminated paddle. He was broad, silver-haired, expensively casual, and he had arrived in a Range Rover that cost more than the milking herd. His name was Gervase Ackroyd, and everyone in the valley knew him. Ackroyd Holdings had spent a decade buying up failing farms across the Dale, consolidating them into an operation that supplied 3 national supermarkets and employed, so the local paper liked to say, 100 good Yorkshire families. He smiled a great deal. He had come to Edmund Harrowgate's funeral and pressed Nell's hand, and told her that if there was anything at all, she should ring him. She understood now what the anything had been. 200,000 from Mr. Ackroyd, 220 anywhere. There was no 220. There was never going to be. The whole valley knew Ackroyd wanted Thornfield. It was the last independent parcel between his eastern holdings and the river, and with it he could run an unbroken line of land from Coombe Edge to the water. People had stopped bidding against him years ago. It was easier and safer to let him win. 200,000 going once. Nell thought about her grandmother, Iris, who had raised her in that farmhouse after Nell's mother left, who had taught her to read weather in the shape of clouds over Coombe Edge, and to set a broken lamb's leg with a splint of hazel and cloth. Iris, who had died when Nell was 19 and who had said to her once, in the low voice she used for things that mattered, "Whatever they tell you about this place, love, the truth is in the ground, under the old dairy. When you've no other card to play, you dig." Nell had been a girl. She had thought it was a story. Going twice. "I'd like to register a bid," Nell said. Her voice was not loud, but the marquee had the acoustics of a held breath, and it carried. 200 faces turned. Rupert Callies found her at last, and something flickered across his features, not recognition, but calculation, the look of a man rapidly repricing a situation. "I'm sorry, madam, this is a registered bidders' auction. You'd have needed to." "I'm Nell Harrowgate," she said. "It's my father's farm you're selling. I registered by post on Tuesday. Reference in your own paperwork, Mr. Callies. You'll find I put down the deposit." The flicker became a frown. Gervase Ackroyd turned in his seat, and for the first time his smile had an effort to it. "Nell," he said warmly, as though greeting her across a garden party, "nobody told me you'd be bidding. My dear girl, I don't think you quite understand what you'd be taking on. This place is 900,000 in the hole once you total the secured lending. You'd be buying a debt that could sink you." "I understand the figure perfectly," Nell said. "I've read every page." "Have you?" A ripple went through the marquee, Not quite laughter, but the cousin of it, the sound a crowd makes when someone unexpected lands a small, clean blow. Callies was flustered now. "Madam, Ms. Harrowgate, the reserve on this lot combined with the secured position means any bid would need to be underwritten. Do you have proof of funds?" "I have this," Nell said, and she walked forward through the parting crowd, and she set a single envelope on the trestle table in front of him. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, and it bore a wax seal she had broken and resealed with tape, because she had not known, when she first opened it 3 nights ago in the cold kitchen at midnight, that she would need it whole. "It's a letter from Coutts. You can ring the number on it." "I'll wait." Nobody in the valley knew, nobody could have known, that 11 years ago, when Nell Harrowgate left Thornfield at 22 with a rucksack and a chip of granite anger in her chest, she had not gone to be a shop girl or a barmaid, or whatever it was the Dale assumed a farmer's daughter did when she vanished. That was the version her father had let stand, because the truth had been the cause of the fight that drove her out, and pride kept them both silent across a decade of unanswered Christmas cards. The truth was that Nell had gone to London, and then to Zurich, and then to a great many places without good coffee, and she had become, quietly, without a single soul in Nethercombe the wiser, one of the most sought-after forensic soil scientists in Europe. Contaminated land, buried liabilities, the invisible chemistry of what men put into the ground and hoped would stay hidden. Mining companies feared her. Developers paid a fortune to have her walk their sites before the lawyers arrived. She had testified in 3 countries. She had, 18 months ago, been paid a consulting fee large enough that the letter from Coutts was not, as Rupert Callies was about to discover, a bluff. But that was not the card Iris had told her to play. That was only the card that got her into the room. "Ring the number," Nell said again, gently. "Then we'll talk about Lot 14. And after that, Mr. Callies, you and I are going to have a rather longer conversation about Lot 9. Callies went still. "Lot 9. "The old dairy," Nell said. "And what's underneath it?" The number Nell had written on the envelope rang through to a private client desk in a building on the Strand, and the woman who answered confirmed, in a voice of unhurried certainty, that Ms. Eleanor Harrowgate was good for a sum that made Rupert Callies' ears color. He put the phone down slowly, as a man sets down something he has just realized is heavier than it looks. Yes, that's in order." He cleared his throat and addressed the Marquis with the brittle brightness of a compere who has lost his script. "We have a competing bid. Ms. Harrowgate, would you care to?" 210,000, Nell said. Gervais Ackroyd laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and public, the laugh of a man who wants everyone to see how relaxed he is, which is generally the surest sign that a man is not. 250, he said. 260. 300. He said it flatly now, the warmth cooling. He had not expected a contest, and a man who buys the whole valley without resistance forgets the muscle it takes to fight. Nell let a silence open. She was doing arithmetic, but not the arithmetic anyone in the room imagined. She was not trying to win the house. She had known before she walked in that she could not outbid Ackroyd Holdings for the land, not sensibly, not with the debt attached, not without spending the one reserve she had into a hole that might never fill. What she needed was not to win. What she needed was for Ackroyd to want it badly enough, publicly enough, to reveal how much he wanted it. Because a man does not pay £300,000 over the odds for a subsiding farmhouse. He pays it for what is under the farmhouse. And if Gervais Ackroyd knew what was under the old dairy, then everything Iris had whispered was true, and the fight to come was far larger than 400 acres. 300,000, Callies said, recovering his rhythm. "Against you, Ms. Harrowgate." "Let him have it," Nell said. The room exhaled. Ackroyd's shoulders dropped a half-inch, relief badly hidden. "But I'd like it minuted," Nell went on, "that Ackroyd Holdings has today paid a premium of roughly 40% above agricultural market value for a residential lot with a condemned east wall and no development consent. I'm sure Mr. Ackroyd has excellent reasons. I only mention it because the land registry is a public record, and one does wonder what a careful buyer knows that the rest of us don't." She said it pleasantly. She smiled at him as she said it, and she watched the exact moment the thought arrived behind Gervais Ackroyd's eyes, the thought that the invisible woman at the back of the marquee was not invisible at all, and had not come to buy a farm. She had come to make him show his hand. Thornfield's farmhouse was cold in the way only a house lately emptied of its owner can be, a cold that had settled into the plaster and meant to stay. The sale did not complete the land under Nell's feet that night. There was a fortnight of conveyancing yet, and by an old provision of her father's tenancy, she had the right to remain in the dwelling until completion. Callies had not liked reminding her of it. She had made him do it in front of witnesses anyway. She let herself in with the key Iris had once kept on a string round her neck, and she stood a while in the dark kitchen, letting the past come up through the flagstones. The range was dead. On the dresser stood the photographs. Iris young and unsmiling in her land girl uniform, Edmund at the ploughing match, 1994, and one of Nell herself at perhaps 7, gap-toothed on the back of a fell pony, a child who had not yet learned that the people who love you can also lie to you for decades and call it protection. She did not cry. She had done her crying in Zurich, alone, when the solicitor's letter reached her, and she understood that her father had spent the last 18 months of his life mortgaging their home to a company she had never heard of and never telling her why. Pennine Land and Credit. She had looked it up on the train north. A small, tidy lending house registered in Harrowgate, 12 years old, unremarkable, except that its ultimate parent, 3 shell companies deep, was a holding vehicle whose sole director was a solicitor who also happened to sit on the board of Ackroyd Holdings. Her father had not borrowed from a bank. He had borrowed, without knowing it or perhaps knowing it too late, from Gervais Ackroyd. And then Ackroyd had called the loan, forced the sale, and bought the farm at auction at a price designed to look like generosity. It was a beautiful piece of work. It was a noose that had been 18 months in the tying, and Edmund Harrowgate had put his own head in it. The question that had brought Nell 400 miles north was simple, and it would not let her sleep. Why? Why would a man worth tens of millions spend 2 years and considerable cunning to entrap one struggling dairy farm he could have bought outright with the change in his coat? Iris had told her the answer, 11 years dead. The truth is in the ground, under the old dairy. Nell lit the storm lantern she found in the boot room, and she went out across the yard. The old dairy was the oldest building on the farm, older than the house, a squat stone thing with a slate roof gone green and a door swollen shut with damp. It had not been used for dairying in Nell's lifetime. Edmund had kept spare fencing in it, coils of wire, a dead tractor battery, the archaeology of a working farm. She put her shoulder to the door and it gave with a shriek of rust. Inside, the smell was cold stone and old iron and something mineral underneath, something she knew professionally and could not yet name. The floor was flagged, great slabs of millstone grit laid down by hands 2 centuries gone. Iris had said under. Nell set the lantern on an upturned crate and began, slab by slab, to look for the one that did not sit true. She found it in the far corner, where a flagstone rocked very slightly under her boot, resealed, at some point, with a mortar that did not match the rest, cement of a color that told her trained eye it had been mixed no earlier than the 1950s. Someone had lifted this stone within living memory and put it back. It took her the better part of an hour, with a wrecking bar from the boot room. When the slab finally came up, the lantern showed her not treasure, not a strongbox, not the romantic thing a child imagines. It showed her a cavity lined with slate, and in it, wrapped in oilcloth gone black with age, a bundle of documents and a single steel sample tin of the kind her own profession still used, the kind used to store a core of soil. She lifted the tin first. Her hands, which did not shake in courtrooms or on contaminated ground, shook now. Someone in her family had taken a soil sample, sealed it, and hidden it beneath a stone half a century ago, and Nell Harrowgate had grown up to become one of the few people alive who could read what such a thing had to say. She prized the lid. Inside, dry and undisturbed, was a core of dark earth, and threaded through it, unmistakable even by lantern light, a gray-black seam that did not belong in Yorkshire pasture. She did not need a laboratory to make the first guess. She had seen that seam on 3 continents. It was the signature of buried industrial waste. Something had been put into the ground at Thornfield, long ago, and someone had known, and someone had taken proof and hidden it and died with the secret. She unwrapped the oilcloth bundle next, and by the failing lantern she read the first page of a letter in a hand she knew as well as her own, because it was Iris's, and it began. If you are reading this, love, then he came for the land at last, and you did what I told you and Doug. Good girl. Now listen, because what they buried here will cost more than the farm to bring up, and there are men who have killed to keep it down. Somewhere out beyond the yard, on the dark lane above the house, a car that had been sitting with its engine off for a long while turned its headlights on. The car on the lane belonged to a man named Dominic Vane. Nell learned this the next morning, when he came down the track on foot in a good overcoat and stood in the yard as though he already owned it, which, as the senior partner of Vane and Callie's, and as she would shortly discover, a director of one of the shell companies above Pennine Land and Credit, he very nearly did. He was older than Callie's, dry and precise, with the unhurried manner of a man who had never once been the person in a room with the most to lose. Ms. Harrowgate. He did not offer his hand. I represent the purchaser. I'm told you were seen in the outbuildings last night with a lamp. I'd remind you that while you retain occupancy of the dwelling, the agricultural buildings passed into contract at the fall of the gavel. Anything removed from them is strictly theft. Then charge me, Nell said. She was drinking tea on the doorstep and did not get up. Ring the police. Let's have them out here with a van and a notebook, and let's have them ask, on the record, what a man pays £300,000 over the odds to make sure a woman doesn't find under a stone floor. I'll wait inside while you make the call. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he did the thing that told Nell more than any threat could have. He changed the subject. Your father, he said, was a proud man. He didn't want you troubled with the state of things. I'd hate to see his wishes disrespected now, by a lot of noise that helps nobody and could, forgive me, expose you to liabilities you don't understand. There are things buried in the past of any old farm. Some are best left lying. You've no idea, Nell said pleasantly, how much I know about things buried in the ground. She let him leave without another word. But when his car had gone, she stood a long while looking at the field below the dairy. A gently sloping 10-acre pasture her father had called Low Ings and never grazed hard, never plowed, and had, she remembered now with a cold jolt, forbidden her as a child from playing in when the beck ran high. She had thought it was because of the water. She understood now it was because of what the water might carry up. Iris's letter, read whole by daylight at the kitchen table, told a story 50 years in the tying. It began in 1968, when Iris was a widow running Thornfield alone and money was short, and a firm of hauliers had come to her with an offer that seemed like a gift. They would pay her a fee, a good fee, to let them tip spoil and inert fill into the worked-out clay pit at the top of Low Ings and level it over. Every farm in the Dale took fill in those years. It was how you reclaimed bad ground. Iris had signed. She had needed the money to keep Edmund, then a boy, in school. The lorries had come at night. That was the first thing that troubled her. Inert fill does not need the cover of darkness. And the drums they tipped were not spoil. They were steel, and some of them wept a liquid that killed the grass where it touched and left the ground the color of a bruise. When Iris confronted the haulier, he told her, pleasantly, the way Vane had been pleasant, that she had signed, that she had taken the money, that she was as liable as anyone now, and that a wise woman would say nothing and let the ground be leveled and forget she had ever seen a drum. The firm was called Rennick Waste Disposal, and Rennick Waste Disposal, Iris had written in her careful hand, had been founded and part-owned by a young and ambitious local man just beginning to build what would become, over the next half-century, the largest agricultural business in the Dale. His name was Gervase Ackroyd's father, Iris wrote, and the boy who used to ride shotgun in those lorries at night, counting the drums, was Gervase himself. He knows what's in Low Ing's love because he helped put it there. And one day, when the law finally catches up to what men did to the ground in those years, this whole valley will be dug up and tested, and Thornfield will be the first place they look, because Thornfield is where the paper trail ends. Whoever owns this farm when that day comes will either be ruined by it or protected from it, depending on whether they own the proof or the proof owns them. So I took a core. I took it the winter you were born, Edmund, from the deepest part of the pit, and I sealed it, and I hid it under the dairy, and I wrote down the drum counts and the dates and the registration of every lorry I could see. It's all here. It's not enough to convict a man on its own, but it's the thread. Pull it and the whole thing comes up. I never used it. I was afraid, and then I was old, and your father never knew. I couldn't tell Edmund because Edmund could never keep his face still, and Ackroyd would have read it on him in a week. But you, Nell, I watched you grow, and you were always the one who could look at a man and give nothing back. You were always the one who dug. If it's you reading this, then trust what's in your own two hands and the science in your own head, and finish what I hadn't the courage to. Nell set the letter down. Outside, the beck ran silver through Low Ing's, carrying whatever it carried down toward the river, and beyond the river toward the reservoir that supplied, she knew from the road signs on the drive north, drinking water to 200,000 people. That was the crisis. That was the thing larger than the farm. Not an old sin sleeping in a field, an old sin leaching, drum by rusting drum, into a public water supply, while the one man who had always known exactly what was down there spent a fortune and 2 years of cunning making certain the land, and the proof, ended in his hands and no one else's. She thought of Gervase Ackroyd pressing her hand at the funeral. If there's anything at all, ring me. He hadn't been offering help. He'd been checking whether she knew. Nell did not go to the police. Not yet. Iris's core and Iris's letter were, as her grandmother had known, a thread and not a rope, a 50-year-old sample with no chain of custody, hearsay about lorries in the dark, a signed tipping agreement that made the Harrowgate name a defendant as much as a witness. Taken to the authorities raw, it would achieve exactly what Vane had warned of. It would expose Nell to liability, invite a well-funded firm of lawyers to bury the whole thing in decades of litigation, and give Ackroyd every excuse to have the field remediated, which was to say, dug up and the evidence carted off in the night, one last time. To make the thread into a rope, she needed 3 things. She needed a fresh sample, taken now properly, with the chain of custody her profession lived and died by. She needed the modern paper, the shell companies, the loan, the reason Ackroyd wanted Thornfield now this year after 50 years of patience. And she needed people. Iris had tried to carry this alone, and it had crushed her into silence for a lifetime. Nell would not make the same mistake. She started with the sample, because the sample she could take with her own hands. She went out to Low Ing's at first light with a hand auger from the boot of her car. She traveled with her tools the way a surgeon might, out of habit and superstition, and she cored the old pit in a careful grid, photographing each hole with the date-stamped field camera she used on paying jobs, bagging and sealing each core, logging depth and grid reference in the waterproof notebook that would, one day, sit in an evidence bag with her signature across the seal. It was slow, cold, methodical work, and it was the most at peace she had felt since her father died, because it was the one thing in all of this she knew how to do perfectly. She was on the 9th core when she found the drum. The auger struck steel at 2 meters and screamed against it, and when she drew the flight up, the last few inches of the sample came out streaked with a gray-black weeping residue, and a smell she knew and hated, the sweet, oily reek of chlorinated solvent, the ghost of an industry that had poisoned half the North before anyone thought to write it down. 50 years in the ground and it was still live, still moving. Still, she thought, looking downhill at the silver thread of the beck, going somewhere. She was photographing the core when she heard the quad bike on the ridge, and looked up to see two of Ackroyd's men sitting astride it, watching her, making no move to come down. One of them lifted a phone and, quite deliberately, took her picture. Let them, she thought. Let Gervais Ackroyd know that the invisible woman was standing in the middle of Low Ings with an auger and a camera, and 50 years of his family's secret coming up out of the ground on the end of it. The war had started. She had simply been the first to know it. The Allies came to Nell in the order she needed them, which is to say in the order the story of the ground required. The first was a woman named Prisha Odidra, an environmental health officer at the district council, whom Nell rang not as a supplicant but as a peer, one professional laying a matter before another, evidence first, emotion nowhere. Odidra was cautious, and her caution was the good kind. She had seen too many landowners cry contamination to dodge a planning refusal, and she said as much. But Nell did not cry contamination. Nell sent her the grid log, the photographs, the depth records, and a single sentence. I've cored a 50-year-old fill site above a Category 1 watercourse, and I'm pulling live chlorinated solvent at 2 meters. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to split my next set of samples and send half to your own accredited lab. Split sampling was the language of someone who expected to be doubted and welcomed it. It was, Odidra would say later, the moment she decided Nell Harrowgate was the real thing. The second ally Nell did not recruit so much as find, sitting in the snug of the Cross Keys in Nethercombe, with half a mile going warm in front of him. His name was Wilf Sowerby, and he was 81, and he had driven for Rennick Waste Disposal from 1966 to 1971. She had gone looking for him because Iris's letter listed lorry registrations, and one registration recurred more than any other, and a man at the post office who knew everything knew whose it had been. Wilf did not want to talk. Wilf had spent 50 years not talking. But Nell did not push. She bought him a fresh mild and told him quietly what was coming up out of Low Ings and where the beck ran and what was downstream. And Wilf Sowerby, who had children in the next valley and grandchildren who drank from the tap like everyone else, put down his glass and said, in a voice that hadn't been used for the truth in half a century, we were told it were fertilizer. We knew it weren't. He had counted the drums too. He had, it turned out, because guilt makes archivists of ordinary men, kept his tally books. The third ally was the dangerous one, and Nell chose her deliberately. A freelance journalist named Kat Bellerby, who had once been the environment correspondent of a national paper, before the paper decided the environment didn't sell, and who now wrote long, unhurried investigations for whoever would pay and several who wouldn't. Nell brought her in not to publish. Publishing too soon would be as fatal as going to the police too soon. But to build the modern paper trail, Nell herself lacked the reach to build. The shell companies, the loan, the reason for the timing. Bellerby, given a thread that ran from a night-tipping operation in 1968 to a live secured lending fraud in the present, worked like a woman who had been waiting years for exactly this. And it was Bellerby who found the timing. The reason Gervais Ackroyd wanted Thornfield now, after 50 years of patience, was a line on a government website that almost nobody read. The Environment Agency had, 18 months earlier, the same month Edmund Harrowgate signed his fatal loan, quietly published its rolling program for the statutory reinspection of historic landfill and unregulated fill sites in sensitive water catchments. It was dry as dust. It was buried in an annex. But Bellerby, who read annexes for a living, found the schedule, and on the schedule, penciled for the coming financial year, was the upper catchment of the Coombe, which meant that within 12 months, agency officers would be walking low ings with augers of their own. Ackroyd had seen it too. Of course he had. A man in his position paid people to watch exactly such schedules, and he had understood, as Iris had predicted half a century before, that the day was finally coming when the ground would be dug up and tested, and that when it was, the liability would fall ruinously, catastrophically on whoever owned the land. Not on the long-dead haulier, not on the shell companies. On the registered proprietor of the field the drums sat in. So Ackroyd had moved to make certain that proprietor was not himself. He had lent Edmund Harrowgate the money to keep the farm afloat, through a chain of companies that hid his hand. He had called the loan and forced the sale. And he had bid at auction not to acquire the liability, but to control the remediation. To be the man who, having innocently bought a contaminated farm, generously paid to have it cleaned up, on his own timetable, with his own contractors, before any agency officer arrived, so that when the inspection came the field would be sweet and empty, and the drums would be gone to some other hole in some other county, and 50 years of buried crime would simply cease to exist. He was not buying a farm. He was buying the power to make evidence disappear legally, in daylight, wearing the costume of a good corporate citizen. And the only thing standing between Gervase Ackroyd and a perfectly clean disappearance was that a soil scientist had come home for a funeral and dug under a stone floor and knew. Ackroyd struck at her the way powerful men strike, not with a fist but with a reputation. The first Nell knew of it was a letter, hand-delivered by Callies, from a firm of London solicitors she had not heard of, informing her that her conduct in trespassing upon and disturbing contracted land, and in publishing alarming and unfounded allegations of contamination, was defamatory of Ackroyd Holdings and injurious to a lawful commercial transaction, and that unless she desisted and retracted, proceedings would follow. It was nonsense. Legally, she had published nothing, but it was not meant to win. It was meant to frighten, and to lay a paper record that painted her in advance as an unstable woman making wild claims about her own family's farm out of grief. The second blow was cleverer. A story appeared in the regional paper, the same paper that liked to call Ackroyd a friend of 100 Yorkshire families, under the byline of a reporter Nell would later learn had dined twice that month at Ackroyd's expense. It did not name her. It did not need to. Described, in tones of gentle concern, how the tragic death of a well-liked local farmer had left a troubled daughter, estranged for many years, and recently returned from abroad, making distressing and baseless claims that had alarmed the community, and it quoted Ackroyd himself saying that he bore the family only goodwill, that he hoped Ms. Harrowgate would find peace, and that he had instructed his own environmental consultants to reassure residents that the land was perfectly safe. His own consultants, his own lab, his own clean result, ready to be produced the moment any one official asked. It was, Nell thought, reading it at the kitchen table while the beck ran poison through low ings, very nearly perfect. He had reframed her as grief-maddened, isolated her as an outsider, promised the valley reassurance, and prepositioned his own tame science to override hers. In a week he had built the frame through which everything she said would now be heard. He had made only one mistake, and it was the mistake such men always make. He had assumed that because no one had ever seen her true value, she had none. He had priced her as the valley had priced her, the vanished daughter, the shop girl, the troubled woman home for a funeral. He did not know about Zurich. He did not know about the 3 courtrooms on 2 continents. He did not know that the woman he had just called baseless in a country newspaper had spent 11 years being the person whose baseline result was the one the other side's tame consultants could never survive contact with. Nell folded the newspaper very neatly and set it down. Then she rang Prisha Odidra and asked one question. When did your split samples come back from the accredited lab? They had come back that morning. And the council's own laboratory, independent, accredited, beyond Ackroyd's reach, had found exactly what Nell's had: chlorinated solvent, live, at concentrations that made Leaching not a planning problem but a statutory emergency. A Part 2A contaminated land determination that the council was now legally obliged to act upon, whatever Gervais Ackroyd's tame consultants said. He had spent 2 years and a fortune building a frame in which Nell Harrowgate was an unreliable woman making things up. He had done it 3 days too late. The science was no longer only in her hands. It was in the public record under the council's seal with a legal duty attached, and there was nothing his lawyers, his lorries, or his friendly newspaper could do to put it back in the ground. Which was the moment, Nell knew, that Gervais Ackroyd would stop being pleasant. Gervais Ackroyd stopped being pleasant on a Tuesday. The council's determination gave Leaching a legal status that changed everything, but law moves at the speed of paper, and Ackroyd understood something Nell had underestimated. A statutory duty to act is not the same as officers standing in the field. There was a window, days, perhaps a fortnight, between the determination and the moment the site would be secured and monitored. In that window, the land was still, by the fall of the gavel, contracted to him. And a man who has spent 50 years learning that drums can be moved in the dark does not forget the lesson simply because the daylight has turned against him. Nell woke on the Tuesday to the sound of a low loader on the lane and the diesel cough of a tracked excavator being unchained. By the time she reached the gate to Leaching's, Ackroyd's contractors were already there. A gang of them, high-vis and hard hats, and Dominic Vane standing at the field's edge in his good overcoat with a sheaf of papers, and the excavator's arm swinging toward the very grid square where Nell had cored the drum. "You're in breach," Vane called before she could speak. "This is contracted land undergoing lawful remediation by the incoming owner. I'd advise you not to obstruct. There are men here who will testify to whatever you do next." He had staged it, she saw. He had brought witnesses of his own, a photographer, the apparatus of a man building a record in which Nell Harrowgate was the aggressor, and Ackroyd the responsible party cleaning up a mess. If she threw herself in front of the machine, she would be the unstable woman of the newspaper story, and the drums would be gone by nightfall. So she did not throw herself in front of the machine. She had 3 days before done the one thing Iris had never had the reach to do. She had made the ground someone else's business. And now she simply lifted her phone, and she did not ring the police. The police would take an hour, and an hour was all Vane needed. She rang Prisha Odidra, who was already at that moment a mile up the lane in a council Land Rover with 2 agency officers and a stop notice, because Nell had told her the night before exactly what a cornered man would try, and Odidra had believed her. The Land Rover came down the track as the excavator's bucket touched the grass. What stopped Gervais Ackroyd's contractors was not Nell Harrowgate's body. It was a piece of A4 paper, a statutory notice under the Environmental Protection Act, served by the enforcing authority, making it a criminal offense to disturb the determined land without consent. Vane read it twice. His overcoat, for the first time, looked like a costume. And the excavator's arm came down, and its engine died, and in the sudden quiet Nell heard the beck running, as it had run for 50 years, carrying its slow poison toward 200,000 taps. They had held the ground, but holding the ground was not winning. Winning meant the man responsible, and the man responsible had never once put his own name on anything. The last and largest truth came, as the largest truths often do, from the smallest and most patient source. Wilf Sowerby's tally books recorded drum counts and dates, but Wilf, it emerged over a 3rd and 4th mile, had kept something else, the delivery dockets. Not Rennick's own dockets, which had long since been destroyed, but the originating dockets, the ones that told a driver where a load had come from before it came to him. Wilf had kept them for the oldest reason in the world, because in 1970 a foreman had told him to burn them, and something in Wilf had refused, and he had taken them home in his jacket and never known why, and they had sat in a biscuit tin in a loft for 50 years. The dockets did not come from local firms. They came from a chemical works 2 counties away, a works that had, in the late 60s, needed to make its own solvent waste disappear cheaply and without record, and had found a young haulier named Ackroyd willing to make it vanish into a Yorkshire clay pit for cash. And the chemical works was not some vanished relic. It had been absorbed, through the ordinary digestion of corporate history, into a group that still existed, still traded, still had a name that appeared on bottles in every kitchen in the country. Iris had thought the secret was Ackroyd's alone. It was bigger than Ackroyd. Ackroyd was the local hands. The money and the origin ran up into a national company that had spent 50 years assuming the drums were gone, the haulier discreet, the field forgotten, and that would, Bellerby said quietly, do a very great deal to keep it that way if it knew the field had been found. Which meant Ackroyd was not, at the last, the antagonist at the top. He was the man in the middle, trapped between a national company that would ruin him to protect itself and a determined woman who had the proof to expose him. And a man in that position, Nell understood, was the most dangerous kind, because he had everything to lose and no clean way out. He asked to meet her. She agreed. She chose the place. Not his office, not a solicitor's room, but the churchyard at Nethercombe, at her father's grave in daylight, with Cat Bellerby's recorder running in her coat pocket and Bellerby herself watching from a car across the lane. He came without Vane. That told her he had come to deal. "You've done well," Gervase Ackroyd said. He looked older in the churchyard than he had at the auction, the geniality gone, and under it something Nell recognized because she had seen it in men at the ends of long frauds, exhaustion. Better than your grandmother. She had it all, 50 years ago, and she buried it under a stone and said nout because she was frightened and because I let her understand what happened to frightened women who talked. He said it without shame, as a simple account. I thought you'd be the same. Grief and a bit of money, and gone by Christmas. You knew my father owed you nothing, Nell said. You built the debt to build the sale. You did it to move drums. You helped tip when you were 16. I did it, Ackroyd said, because if I hadn't, the agency would have dug that field and I'd have gone to prison, and my 200 employees would have gone to nothing, and the company that actually made that poison would have paid a fine it could find down the back of the sofa and carried on. That's the truth of it, Nell. I'm the only one who ever paid a penny to keep this valley fed, and you're about to burn it down for a principle. He reached into his coat, and for a moment the churchyard was very quiet, but it was not a threat he drew out. It was a check. Name it. The farm's yours, debt cleared, and enough on top that you never work again. All I need is the tin, the letter, the dockets, and your silence. Your grandmother took less. Nell looked at the check, and then at her father's grave, and then at the man who had spent 2 years engineering the death of everything her family had built. My grandmother, she said, spent 50 years believing she was too small to win because you taught her that. You taught a whole valley to stop bidding against you. That's the actual crime, Mr. Ackroyd, not the drums. The drums were 1968. The crime is that you spent half a century making certain nobody ever thought they could stand in front of you and say no. She did not take the check. So, no. She let him hear the word. Then she told him what was going to happen, not as a threat, but as a forecast, the way she read weather off the clouds over Coombe Edge. The determination stood. The samples were in the public record. Wilf's dockets ran the chain up to the national company, and Bellerby would publish all of it, sourced and documented, the following week, unless Ackroyd chose in the next 7 days to be the man who came forward. Not for a check. For the only thing left that could save any part of what he'd built. To turn the evidence over himself, name the company that had paid him, and take the fall as a witness rather than a defendant. You can be the man who buried it, Nell said, or the man who dug it up. You've spent 50 years being the first. You've 1 week to decide if you'd rather be the second. She walked away across the churchyard and did not look back, and the recorder in her pocket had every word. The showdown was not a trial. It was a public inquiry, 8 months later in the town hall at Harrowgate, and by then the story had done what buried things do once the stone is lifted. It had come all the way up. Bellerby's investigation had run across 4 countries' worth of the national company's paper. The agency had secured leaching, exhumed the drums, and traced the plume in the aquifer to within a mile of the reservoir intake, which had been switched to an alternative supply the week the determination landed. 200,000 people who never knew how close it had run, and never needed to. The council's determination had triggered a wider reinspection that found 3 more of Ackroyd's father's old tipping sites across the Dale. And Gervais Ackroyd, in the end, had taken the week Nell gave him and made his choice. He came forward. He sat at the inquiry, and he named the chemical works, and the men who had paid him, and the arrangement that had run drums into Yorkshire clay for cash across 4 years of the 1960s, and he did it knowing it ended him, that Ackroyd Holdings would be broken up to pay for the remediation, that he would face charges as a witness who had also been a perpetrator, that the geniality that had ruled the valley for 50 years was finished. He did it because Nell had shown him the one exit that left anything standing, and because, she suspected, some part of a man who has carried a thing for 50 years is simply tired of carrying it. The national company fought and lost, and paid properly, ruinously, the way it had never once paid before. The valley did not fall to nothing. The employees Ackroyd had used as his human shield were, in the end, protected in the restructuring, because that had been part of what Nell held out to him, and part of what she meant. And the woman at the center of it, the vanished daughter, the shop girl, the troubled outsider home for a funeral, stood up at the inquiry when they finally called her, and gave her evidence in the flat, exact, unshakable voice of someone who had done this in 3 courtrooms on 2 continents, and watched the room reprice her in real time. She named her profession. She laid out the science. She produced the chain of custody, unbroken, from Iris's core under the dairy floor to the accredited lab. And when the national company's silk rose to suggest, as such men do, that a grieving woman might have been mistaken about her own family's land, Nell Harrowgate looked at him and said, quietly, that she had testified in matters larger than his, and would be happy to have her credentials read into the record if he'd like. He did not like. He sat down, and the room understood, all at once and far too late, that they had been looking at the most important person in the story from the very beginning, and had simply never thought to see her. She kept the farm. That was the ending Iris would have wanted, and it was the one Nell chose, though she could have sold the cleared land for a great deal by then. Low Ings was scraped and remediated and in time seeded back to grass, clean ground at last, the drums gone not into another county's dark but into proper containment, logged and lawful. She did not go back to Zurich. She took work she could do from the farmhouse with the subsiding east wall now repaired, and she ran a small herd, badly at first and then less badly, and she learned the weather off Coombe Edge the way her grandmother had taught her. Wilf Sowerby lived to see the drums come up, and told the story in the snug of the Cross Keys to anyone who'd buy him a mild, and never once had to pay for one again. Prisha Odidra was promoted. Cat Bellerby's investigation won a prize, and she sent Nell the certificate, because she said the byline should have had 2 names. Dominic Vane was struck off. Gervais Ackroyd, an old man now and a poor one, was seen sometimes on the lane above Thornfield, looking down at the field, and Nell let him look, because there is a kind of victory that has no need to close the gate. On the last evening of the first summer, Nell went out to the old dairy and lifted the loose flagstone one final time, and into the empty slate-lined cavity where Iris had hidden the truth for 50 years, she placed a copy of the inquiry's findings, and the newspaper that had once called her baseless, and a photograph of a gap-toothed girl on a fell pony who had grown up to be the person her grandmother had known she would be. Then she set the stone back true and mortared it, and let the ground keep something honest for once. Because the ground remembers everything, Iris used to say, The only question is whether you've the courage to ask it what it knows. Nell Harrowgate had asked, and the ground had answered. And the men who buried the truth learned, one by one and far too late, that they had spent 50 years underestimating the one person who had always known how to dig.